Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
All right, well, then I get double time. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm State Senator Jill P. Carter. I am a member of the Senate Judicial Proceedings Committee. Anton's law was a bill that I sponsored in combination with the cross-file Delegate Gabriel Acevero, and it was a part of the overall reform package of 2021. But I will say that the two hardest efforts of all of the legislation that we got passed, I would say, would be both Anton's law, keeping it in a pure form, as well as the the concept of civilian oversight of police. So with that, I will pass it on. I will say that outside of the legislature, which is part-time, I'm a criminal defense attorney primarily. And so because of the work I've done throughout my life as a lawyer, I've always been keenly aware of the incredible need for police reform and accountability. And even though Maryland took it up in 2021, it was an effort that really began and went ignored for about 15 years prior to that. Thank you.
Hello. Okay, so my name is Janis. I'm a reporter for the Real News Network, which is a nonprofit news service based in Baltimore, and host of the Police Accountability Report, which is on that same channel.
Oh, okay. I'll give it a try. Hello, my name is Taya. I'm the host of the Police Accountability Report with my colleague Stephen Janis. We primarily focus on the criminal justice system in Baltimore City, but we also do reporting around the country. We do investigations in areas that have news deserts, so we try to get accountability and transparency for police departments across the country, but of course Baltimore is our primary focus.
Thank you all so much. And so you kind of alluded to my first question, which is, from your perspective and given the work that you do, why was the passage of Anton's law so critical, and why do you think there's so much resistance from law enforcement to comply with this law? So you mentioned this a little bit, but if you want to elaborate. I'm sorry, this is for the entire panel.
Okay, stop.
So I think it's important to put some larger political context to situate Anton's law. When you think about many of the social movements that came to a zenith in the 60s and 70s, civil rights, black power, anti-war, and you think about the way that law enforcement was weaponized against those movements. So you talk about the counterintelligence program, for which we wouldn't have known about unless the Church Commission in 1972, where someone literally broke in, right, to the FBI offices and was able to get records that demonstrated the illegal means that law enforcement was weaponized to use against those engaged in social movements against the status quo. So in using that context, right, and if we look at the Fraternal Order of Police, really is a political arm, right? It's hyper-conservatism as a political arm against, particularly when you talk about, the Black freedom struggle, and you think about, whether it's the Black Panther Party, Nation of Islam, the BLA, you think about the radical formations that were most, even the elements of the civil rights movement, that were most targeted by law enforcement, and continue that, civil rights, black power continues to be something that law enforcement politically situates itself in opposition to. When you look at the institution of law enforcement, one of the ways that it's able to maintain its power is its ability to not be transparent with the inner workings of the department. So if you look at many of the illegal means that were used against, as the organizations that I just mentioned and many others, those were hidden from the public. And because they were hidden, and when the Church Commission took place, right, where there were hearings that were made available to the public, right, then it created a context where folks were able to effectively push back policy-wise and require more government transparency. So when we look at law enforcement as it's currently constituted, and you look at the legacy of police brutality, and I think sometimes we focus just on those who've been killed by law enforcement. That's certainly important, but just think about many of the daily abuses, right? Violence, brutality, the way that law enforcement is politically used. So we look at that wide range of violence that law enforcement as an institution has visited upon folks of African descent, people of color more broadly, one of the things we don't have access to are the records that would allow folks to be able to lodge successful legal challenges to law enforcement, or even political challenges to law enforcement. And so Anton's law, the perspective that I carry with it, and I think many others would be aligned with, is the notion that requiring law enforcement, or at least making it available for law enforcement to disclose investigatory records, provides the basis for those of us that are challenging the larger system of law enforcement and the violence that it visits upon Black people, that we're able to use the information we get about the brutality that law enforcement engages in as as an additional tool against the system of racism and white supremacy and how it manifests itself against folks of African descent in this society.
Thank you. So, as I said when I opened, that the struggle for any type of police accountability and transparency was a long one, well before George Floyd, well before Freddie Gray. And the Maryland General Assembly was largely resistant to taking any measures to reform police in any way. Even getting legislation put in that would increase training was met with great resistance here. And so it was when I went to work with the Baltimore Civilian Review Board and I learned of the enormous number of police complaints that the Civilian Review Board was unable to gain access to. And when I learned that so many, the overwhelming number of police complaints were unsustained by the agency, and then later we came to learn that the members of the now infamous Gun Trace Task Force had a multitude of unsustained complaints, and even some sustained complaints, and even with sustained complaints, Wayne Jenkins and one of the others was able to still be promoted within the agency and even given awards as like top law enforcement officer. So those things highlight the fact that it's critically important that the complaints be open to the public, disclosable to the public, and that the disciplinary actions that are taken, if any, are disclosable to the public, because in so doing, there's a much greater chance to guard against them being shrouded in secrecy, to allow a law enforcement agency to protect, to continually unsustain. And when I say unsustained, I mean, I think one of the officers, and I don't think I'm exaggerating, 80-some complaints, another had 40-some complaints, 60-some complaints. It's outrageous. And nobody ever knew. Nobody would have ever known had the situation not gotten to what it did. So we believe very strongly that you can put in a great disciplinary scheme to try to bring accountability. You can put civilians on a board that makes a disciplinary decision, but at the end of the day, the only way to really ensure accountability is to have those records disclosable to the public to guard against the type of secrecy that has existed, not just in Baltimore, but across the agencies in the state and the nation.
Okay, sure.
Well, I'm so excited by the fact that you were able to successfully pass Anton's law. I think it's also known as the Public Information Act. But I can say that, unfortunately, I'm still having trouble getting body camera footage, and so are so many other members of our community. I think there was a Montgomery County community group that was being charged $95,000 for the records that they requested. So for members of the community who are interested in receiving these records, reporters like myself who are trying to get body camera footage, in particular, this was body camera footage that I was trying to get for Sergeant Ethan Newberg. He had received 32 counts indictment for his actions against Baltimore City residents during his arrest. And I actually have just like one small example of one of the arrests that he did. Newberg was checking for warrants when a bystander commented that it wasn't right to make someone sit on wet concrete. He then continued to walk by. Newberg ran after him and put him in cuffs. The man asked, "What am I going to jail for?" To which Newberg replied, "Because you don't know how to act." The indictment says that when the bystander challenged Newberg's authority to make the arrest, Newberg told him, just go to jail and take your charge like a man. So this is the officer that we wanted to receive the body camera footage for. 32 different counts against this officer. And we can't get it. And later I can go into more depth about the process that I went through, going to the ombudsman, the fact that it took the Baltimore City Police Department several months even to acknowledge that I sent them a records request. But I think part of the problem is that the ultimate reason that I was denied was because this is under investigation. And Stephen can talk a little bit more about why that's problematic.
Yeah, just thank you, everyone. And I can testify, because I covered Senator Carter for quite some time, that the presumption, we think the law, the MPIA law, is supposed to be the presumption that records should be public, but what I've seen from just covering what Senator Carter has done and what we've tried to do, that the presumption is it should not, especially when it comes to law enforcement, has a special ability and tools to obfuscate and to prevent. You know, in the case of Ethan Newberg, it's been 9 months, and at the end of it all, they just said it's still under investigation. He's been charged, and his trial hasn't, I think it's scheduled now for sometime this year. But the point being that there are many ways still to thwart, any sort of impact. I remember 10 years ago, I was trying to get records for the helicopter, the state helicopter, bought some AW-139s, which are extremely expensive military-style helicopters, and the word was the state was spending an exorbitant amount of money. So I filed for repair and work orders so I could get a handle on it, report to the public, and they wanted to charge $200,000. And I think the point that we're making is that the progress that Senator Carter made is amazing, but that still I think there's a cultural presumption that we will say, oh, we have these great transparency laws, but when you dig down and try to get some information that might actually be illuminating, it's like, no, it's under investigation, it's privileged communication, it's et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And despite the best efforts of Senator Carter and leaders of a beautiful struggle, it still is the presumption that you can't get them or you're going to pay a heavy price.
Thank you so much for that. And you kind of went into my next question. So we've known that since the passage of Anton's law, journalists as well as advocacy groups and even individuals who are requesting information on complaints they filed themselves have received a huge price tag to get access to those records. So what has been your experience as journalists with police weaponizing fees to shield information about police misconduct records, and how do you try to get that information anyways? What's the workaround? Yeah, for you too.
As Taya was saying, the under investigation sort of clause is very open-ended with no statutory limits. So in other words, even if you don't have any, they don't have to make any sort of statements or anything proving that they're still investigating a case, and thus they can deny you records just straight up without any sort of. And after our 8 or 9 months on the Ethan Newberg case, do you want to talk about, because that was what happened, and I think that's a real, that's just one of several things that they can do to say, you have no right to these records. I don't know, Senator Carter, if that applies to internal investigations too, that they can say it's under investigation, but this is something we come across. So it's very easy to throw out there, but there's no sort of, requirement for them to prove this. One of the cases we're joined by Jane Miller, came down with us. We've been working with her, but we worked on the Ray Rivera case, which is a case that was on Netflix. And years went by, and they would never release any of the files. Only till Netflix broadcast to the world did they release the files, but they would always say it's under investigation. And I think that's something that we encountered. Do you want to?
Well, I would just say this, and maybe this is a question someone can help answer for me. Just to talk a little bit more about the specific case with Ethan Newberg, this is a police officer who was making over $240,000 a year. So when you consider what the average police officer's salary is, this is an officer who was putting in some amazing overtime, one could argue. And so I think this is definitely in the public interest. We have credible allegations that he was using unconstitutional practices against members of our community. The state's attorney's office in Baltimore found it reasonable enough to charge him with 32 separate counts. I think this is a matter of public interest. And so at this point, I'm just looking here back into my email chain and trying to get this information. And so on March 7th in 2022, I sent the PIA request, And I went through all the appropriate processes that you're supposed to, and I went to the, but that was after the Baltimore Police Department assiduously just ignored me. It's as if I sent them nothing. So that's why I had to go to the ombudsman. And at this point, they say, well, you know, you do have a point. They should have responded to you in a more timely fashion, and they didn't. But this is unresolved, and I literally don't know what the next steps are. I don't know what else I can do. I've taken all the appropriate steps.
Go to court, but that's expensive.
It actually does well to my next question, and this is for the entire panel. What would make the ombudsman more effective in resolving these issues?
Power.
So we learned last year, a year after Anton's law had been passed, about the obstacles that members of the public as well as the media were experiencing in trying to get these records. And so I remember, I think it was the beginning of the 2022 session, I sponsored a bill that would, I think initially, the initial iteration was that would simply make it free. But you know, after dealing with the body that I'm dealing with and some of the opposition to that concept, we decided to put together a task force that would bring all of the sides together and decide how to come up with a reasonable process. For example, I think the challenge or the task was to look at what's being requested. For example, something that can be digital, that's just like body camera footage, that shouldn't really be a cost. But this concept that you've got to do all this review and produce all these documents in today's world, that simply isn't reasonable, because most things, even in lawsuits and law cases now, all of discovery is digital. All of it comes digital. You get no paperwork at all. And so that was supposed to happen, but I've recently learned that the task force, I don't believe, and frankly, ACLU and others can let me know exactly what happened. They didn't meet. And so I think that signals that what we have to be cautious about now, and this happens with a lot of issues, is that the legislature may be comfortable that they passed a law, but not be concerned about implementation and effect, because, you know, we feel like, you know, our work is done here, because I don't know that for most of the body it was really that important that the records get disclosed. I think the real carrot was to be able to say we passed, you know, sweeping police reform legislation that could be a model for the country, as opposed to actually the practical reality. And so I think the answer lies in, again, pressing up against us, the legislature, to take the steps necessary to make this happen. And let's be clear, and this is always the case when it comes to police. I used to say, and it was true, that the legislature didn't, the one area that they didn't make laws was in policing. They allowed the F.O.P. and the police agencies to make and chiefs and sheriffs to make the laws for themselves. They refused to interfere with their ability to make their own laws. And I think when it comes to these kinds of things, you have to keep in mind the ombudsman, the entire process under the AG's office is all legislated. So at the end of the day, come back to the legislature to get those things done if it's necessary.
Thank you. Did anyone else have anything to add to that about the ombudsman?
Oh, well, I just think I just think the ombudsman should have more power. I'm not sure, you know, for example, with the Open Meetings Act board, they can issue they can say that a body violated the act. Maybe if there's some way, can the ombudsman say that an agency is in violation of the MPIA? Because something like that would be helpful, you know, because they can just string it out for as long as they want. The responding agency has no incentive to act, and it's very frustrating. As Taya said, we've been working on support for MPIA requests for 11 years. So something where the ombudsman can do something that would somehow coerce the agency to follow the law.
Thank you for that. So next, this question's for you, Davon. Anton's law went into effect over a year ago, but it's now being challenged in court by the Montgomery County Fraternal Order of Police. It's no secret Montgomery County has a severe history of police harm to residents, specifically black residents. Explain to the audience how this lawsuit came about and why this lawsuit is both flawed and problematic.
So, kind of along the lines that has been talked about so far with the passage of Anton's law, and we kind of anticipated it as we were pushing for it, that law enforcement would do all it could, even with the law being passed, to find ways to prevent the disclosure of those records. And one of the things that I thought as we were pushing for Anton's law is that one of the things that folks were most afraid of is that the disclosures, that if they eventually came, people will recognize the problems that are in their jurisdictions in ways that many of them would prefer not to know. So even in advocating for Anton's law, one of the things that elected officials in different jurisdictions around the state would say, "Oh, that's a Baltimore City thing. We don't have problems in our jurisdictions." And one of the things that I would say in response is the only legitimate answer to the question as to whether there's a problem with law enforcement in your jurisdiction is I don't know. Because the information that would allow one to make that determination at that time was not legally disclosable to the public. So one of the things that happened in Montgomery County is that there was an attempt, as Anton's law was being pushed forward through the legislature, the county and the F.O.P. They had a side deal. So they created a contract or a change to their collective bargaining contract that basically created an additional process or an additional entry point for law enforcement, such that when a request was made, that the officer had 2 days to review the things that were potentially going to be disclosed and then file a lawsuit that would delay the disclosure of those files, right? And so as a tact, essentially allowing the F.O.P. to review the records as well before those records would be disclosed. And in Anton's law, the term, the records being inspected, that meant like when the files were given to the requester. But the way that the Montgomery County F.O.P. and the county constructed the ability for an officer to intervene, the investigated files, they interpreted it as when the request was made. So that provides then the opportunity for law enforcement to further delay the process of the disclosure of those records. And so the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability is currently intervening in that lawsuit in addressing this additional lever that the F.O.P. was able to provide for law enforcement to delay the disclosure of those records. I think really the lesson to take from that is we have to wonder, to the extent that law enforcement is going to withhold those records, I think we should all be concerned about what's in them, right? And I would argue that once those disclosures are made, I think the General Assembly will be forced to make additional changes to the ones that were made in 2021. But one thing I want to add, and this goes off of what Senator Carter just mentioned, the General Assembly, because this is an issue that we've been pushing for a while, but was a non-starter. And one of the things that Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, once said is that when it comes to issues that impact black people primarily, just to get reform requires bloodshed, not even revolution, right? And it took people having to see George Floyd being killed to move the legislature to do what it did, which in many respects really is the bare minimum. And so I think it's important that when we think about how the legislature has related to law enforcement, as Senator Carter said, law enforcement has been allowed to essentially write the laws that govern how they operate, and even in the face of passing legislation that theoretically should get us what we want, they find other ways to try to get around it. So I think it's important for all of us to be vigilant about the ways that law enforcement tries to circumvent the law. And Senator Carter said there may be additional legislative action that needs to be taken in order to provide more teeth when agencies, refuse to disclose records that we're lawfully entitled to.
I would just add to that an example relating to Baltimore City and the power of the F.O.P. The Baltimore City taxpayers paid for an audit of police overtime, and I'm sure you can imagine why that was important, as I mentioned Ethan Newberg's salary. And so we paid for this audit, but the Fraternal Order of Police sued the city, I believe on the basis that they were alleging that, I think it was, they were getting underpaid? Yes. Yeah, I had to double check my notes. It sounds a little absurd. That they were actually being underpaid. And so this ended up, because of the lawsuit, this was listed, I believe, as attorney work client product. Yes. And so we weren't allowed to see it. So that audit, we still haven't seen this audit. So I just mentioned that to show how the F.O.P. participates in this political economy and is constantly pushing against transparency.
And just to add a couple points to the claims that the F.O.P. is making in this lawsuit, one of the claims that they're making, they filed a reverse PIA, which essentially is allows the subject of the record to file a suit challenging the release of the record. But that only happens if there's a prohibition against those records being released, and in which this case it is not. And so a lot of the claims that they're making in this lawsuit are just both flawed and improper, and are trying to basically litigate what the arguments they failed to make in committee. And so that case is still ongoing. Our coalition, the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability, has moved to try to intervene in the case to push back. And this is something that's ongoing, and we're going to continue to need your support and your, watch something that this is something you should continue to watch. And we might have to come back and pass additional legislation, which kind of leads to my next question. And some of you have alluded to this a little bit. From your perspective, I'll start with Senator Carter. What more needs to be done to defend and strengthen Anton's law?
So this is very interesting, you guys. Today happens to be the day in session that is the last day to file a request for a bill which will ensure that it would get a timely hearing this session. And that deadline is 5 p.m. So since I've been on this panel for these few minutes, I've heard two issues that I thought were something that we needed to address. So I've literally, if you see me texting, I'm not I'm not distracted. I'm texting my legislative director, Chad Leo, there, and specifically saying, first of all, I wasn't really aware fully of what the arguments with the going with Montgomery County, but they're basically they're making their own law that's outside of what the state law is, and in my opinion, that's not okay. So I think maybe we need to put in additional wording in our legislation and our statute that basically, that prohibits those kinds of additional layers and barriers to disclosure of records. So that's one thing. And I think, I just suggested that we get it done now. We're pretty close to the bill limit, but if we can squeeze it in, we will. And the other one is the idea that Stephen, Janis, and Taya said, the idea of giving the ombudsman more authority. I held back on that because I thought that the task force that we put together last year was going to do it. But here it is. We have a task force in law. It was a statute. It was, created last year. And basically they haven't met, and no one forced them to meet. And I'm sure that the powers that be were well aware that they weren't meeting. And so clearly that wasn't good enough. So I think you don't just sit back and allow that to happen. I think you've got to go back and revisit the issue and make some mandates in law that force them to do their jobs. So that's what I think in terms of legislation right now.
That's why they call her the people's champion. Thank you.
Well, the thing you brought up, and a lot of the organizations that, like news organizations, we're a small nonprofit news organization. We can't just trot out a lawyer, and they know that. They know that they can grind us into the ground, and eventually we'll just give up because we can't afford to hire counsel. So that's why the ombudsman's power would be so important, that at least there's some mechanism for people who can't afford to fight the F.O.P. has a lot of money and a lot of lawyers. We know this because we encounter their lawyers in a lot of different cases, criminal cases, whatever. So there has to be some power for people who don't have the means, including our organization, to go to court and litigate this. That there's got to be something I think is important.
Thank you all so much. So at this point, we're going to go ahead and do some closing remarks and then open up to the audience for any questions.
Oh,
if you have any.
You want to start?
Okay. Well, I guess my only closing remark would be is that I'm a bit more hopeful than I came in here being. I have really run up against some walls trying to make records requests, get body camera footage, get salary information, and I'm just doing this on behalf of public interest. And I'm really hoping that Senator Carter will be able to make some changes that'll make it easier for people like myself and other community groups who have valid interests to be able to get these vital records. I think we know for sure that the reason why we have Anton's law is because one of the officers who was involved in Anton Black's death, the officer that precipitated the arrest that led to the chase, that led to the tasering, that led to the chokehold, that led to his death on his mother's steps, that officer, Thomas Webster, he had moved from Delaware And he had actually been caught on camera, not on body camera because we couldn't get that, but on CCTV camera, kicking a compliant suspect in the head. And there were many use of force complaints against this officer. And if we had been able to have access to that information, if the community had been able to have access to that information, he may have never ended up on the Greensboro Police Department police force, and Anton could be alive today. And that's why the law even exists.
Well, I think it's clear, and Senator Carter can attest to this, that transparency is not a big, what would be the word, concern in Annapolis, and truthfully, you have been a person who's one of the few people who've done it. But, about 15 years ago, I did an investigation of overtime, and we published all the overtime and salaries of Baltimore City Police Department. We got a call from the police department saying that we were exposing undercovers, and it was blah, 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 and there was all reason we shouldn't do it. And now it's routine. And I think there's a culture in governance that transparency is somehow harmful, and they come up with a lot of ways to make it impossible. But things that 10 years ago, we published that supposedly we shouldn't have are now considered routine. And so I think that my only point would be just keep pushing. We have to keep pushing because they have more power, more resources than we do. And, so that's important.
Thank you. My closing remarks would be to all of you out there and all of the people watching. I think that on this issue of Anton's Law and transparency and accountability for law enforcement, but all of the issues around really realizing the results that we wanted and pushing all of the legislation, which was necessary reform of policing. This conversation and also my experience of the legislature together lead me to believe that it's critically important that you not let up, because I really feel strongly that given the fact that the laws went into place, were passed in 2021, there will be no desire or will to revisit that issue. And in fact, the narrative that is being promoted throughout Baltimore City and Maryland right now is a real high emphasis on violent crime and juveniles, and this concept that we need more police, and the problems in Baltimore City center around we don't have enough police, which is a false narrative in terms of public safety. And so what's important is for people to continue to write and create our own narrative, and also press your elected officials and your legislative representatives to continue down the crusade of actually realizing the law enforcement reform that we set out to do, and that is in the best interest of the people, and not just be able to go on national news circuits and say, oh, we passed the most sweeping legislation in the country, but not tell the whole story that much of it is still not working for the people. Thank you.
Just on the point of public safety, I think oftentimes the conversation about police brutality is often detached from the conversation about public safety. The legislature commissioned a report that was released in 2020, commissioned in 2018, the Restoring Trust and Policing Commission. And there's a particular section where they talk about people, and I think they focused on Baltimore City, folks' attitudes about law enforcement. And out of the folks that they had talked to, they said about 70% of the folks they talked to had either neutral or positive associations with law enforcement. But the majority of them, I think they said over 60% of them, had all witnessed law enforcement do things they thought were unethical, right, and abusive. So these are people who have positive or at least neutral beliefs in law enforcement, but the majority of them have seen law enforcement do things that are problematic. And what the study mentioned is that it had a public safety impact, because in terms of getting people to work with law enforcement, to be able to address the violence in the community, that even people who would generally be positive in working with law enforcement did not trust law enforcement because of the corruption that they had themselves witnessed. And one of the conclusions that the report made was that transparency of law enforcement would increase collaboration with folks in the community with law enforcement to address the issue of public safety. So I think this issue of disclosure of records is important, because to the extent that law enforcement can be helpful in the issue of public safety, and I argue, and others argue, that the bigger role is really for the community and community-based organizations to deal with the issue of violence in the community. But to the extent that law enforcement can be helpful to public safety, the lack of transparency hurts the ability for law enforcement to have the kind of relationships that would actually lead to addressing public safety. So I wanted to raise that point as something that I think is important to talk about, in addition to the way that police brutality is perpetrated, and the lack of transparency impacts our ability to address that as well.
Thank you all so much. So at this point, we'll open it up to the audience to ask questions. And Casey's walking around with a mic.
Thank you.
Thanks all so much for this. I wanted to add a couple of things about what's going on in Montgomery County. First, it's actually they have 10 days notice, not 2, which is crazy, to respond or to file a lawsuit. But the reason they were able to enter into that agreement is because Anton's law didn't include a collective bargaining preemption clause. And so I think Senator Carter, that hopefully that's one of the things that, you know, we can do, but that because a lot of the other police reform legislation did. So they were allowed to go ahead and collectively bargain, and they entered into this agreement. And the reason that we've been given, you know, from our county executive for why this was necessary involves the technical infraction exception, which, you know, hasn't come up. And that's another big obstacle we've seen is like how we all, like the 2 major reasons you can not give records is 1, they're still under the case is still under investigation, or 2, it involves a technical infraction. So, you know, one thing I wanted to share is that when we've requested records in Montgomery County, and we've been told that we're not going to give them to you because this involved a technical infraction, we have no way to like challenge that conclusion. We've gone back and said, well, can you, without obviously telling us what the records say, can you at least tell us generally like what the nature of the infraction was, or like how, like give us some information to let us understand why you characterize this as a technical infraction. So that's one thing that I'd be interested to know if anyone else has seen. But the reason that our county executive gave for why this MOA was necessary is because they were afraid of being sued for releasing things that actually were technical infractions. And so they wanted to have the police, the F.O.P. and the police, like do a double check about what a technical infraction is or is not. So I don't know if there are like legislative fixes to more clearly, you know, address what is a technical infraction or not. I mean, I think it's bullshit, and that was just their excuse. But that's another area that I think continues to need some more work, is this whole issue around technical infractions and whether or not departments are abusing the technical infraction exception.
That's definitely been coming up, and to add to that, the law gives the custodian discretion to release a technical infraction if it's in the matter of public interest. And so that's, you know, something we definitely need to talk more about. Thank you for raising that.
Thank you. My name is Stephen Waddy. I'm with the NAACP. I just wanted to say a couple things. One, that I think what Davon said about the history of Black people being believed in this country is really what we're talking about on much of this level. Is the reason why we want to focus on communities is that no matter what, Black people aren't believed when they file complaints, when they're discussing their issues, and one of the issues that the reasons why we like Twitter so much is because white people are gaining access to the internal conversations of Black people about the issues that we're having. And what this MPIA does is allow the rest of us to see the internal conversations of the government about their own actions. And I think that allows us to see where trust is falling and why the social contract that, you know, is between Black people and their government is failing in this colonial environment. And I was wondering whether or not you all saw a different method of moving forward in order to gain access to these, because I mean, I personally would like to see the F.O.P. be banned from existence, you know, as opposed to having to constantly negotiate with these people and, you know, hear their numerous excuses as to why they remain racist. And, you know, like, it's been, you know, 15 years, it's been 300 years of this craziness, listening to overseers talk about why Black people are resisting. Used to be, there was a psychological disorder that we had. So I'm just, and it's not just Black folk. It's you know, Black women are in specific subject to violence, intimidation. We hear about gaslighting all the time by police departments in a way that Black men may not necessarily experience, or any other group may not experience. In Annapolis here, we had an entire, we had an individual who ignored sexual assault complaints, and he was he still did not receive the level of punishment that he should have because of some technical infractions, as they would say, in regards to his Fifth Amendment privileges being violated during an administrative versus a criminal investigation. And so, like, those issues that may come up are still not allowing us to gain access to justice. And I think that that's probably where, that's my lodestar, as they say, or North Star.
So all the issues that I've just heard are, I think, really important issues. And I just want to say that what's important is that all of you keep your finger on the pulse of the legislators. My experience of the Maryland General Assembly, though it is different today than it was many years ago, is that it leans in the opposite direction of accountability for law enforcement. What happened 2 years ago was largely done not only just under pressure, but a couple of other dynamics were at play. One of the things that was at play is that after George Floyd, surveys and polling was done across Maryland, and what was really compelling is that white people that were middle class and even wealthy were polled to say that they wanted more accountability for law enforcement. That's what made the difference in a large part. Okay, not just that we saw the video, and not just that, as this young gentleman from NAACP just said, that black people have been coming down here in busloads complaining for years that their children had been being murdered in front of them, like Anton Black, by law enforcement. That was never compelling. Now, granted, we've come a little bit of ways from back in the older days in the General Assembly. We have new leadership. We have a black woman speaker. We have a younger Senate president. And so much of the body is younger and more progressive than back in the day. But nevertheless, it's going to require them to believe that their constituencies and Marylanders generally are still on these issues, and they're just not running around telling them we're scared of the children and you need to lock them up, because that's what has been largely in the media recently.
And just to add to that, if you want to support that work, please join the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. Next question?
Oh, thank you very much.
Yeah, we have some hands up here too. We'll get to.
They're trying to ban to black the room. No worries. Hello, everyone. LaShonda Jackson from the Funders Committee for Civic Participation. It's funny because I was trying to figure out, listening to this, am I sitting here as just a regular citizen from Baltimore City, or am I sitting here as an executive director that's steeped deep in these particular issues? And so I think a little bit of both. And I think when I listen to these conversations, one of the things that sort of gives me a bit of an attitude is I feel like a big part of this issue is our elected representatives themselves and the money and politics issue. And you mentioned a little bit before about the Fraternal Order of Police and all the money that they have, and it just seems like a lot of these issues that we're dealing with is coming from our own representatives and their lack of spine to stand against the Fraternal Order of Police, to stand against the police. And I think for me personally, I was really, really stunned with the murder of Mike Brown and then Freddie Gray in my own city, to see just how toothless the mayor of these cities were to actually do something about what had just happened in their cities, to see how toothless the city councils seemed to be to actually respond to the needs of their citizens who were literally under the knees of police officers. And when you peeled it back, when you peeled the layers back, they were really scared of losing their sweet cookie jars. They were scared of losing their funding, for their next campaign. And that seems to be an issue that we absolutely need to address, or else we're going to continue to be in this circle. And I fear 10 years from now, we'll be having the same conversation. Like, how much trauma do we really need to go through before our elected officials really start to do what they were elected to do, which is to represent the people and not the money and the wealth and the well-connected? And so I get a little bit annoyed with these conversations because I don't think it's as hard as we make it out to be. But there are people who are truly standing in the way of progress, and it seems to be, the root of that seems to be that love of money.
So one thing I want to say quickly to that, because I agree with you. Certainly, money is a big influence of what elected officials do. If we look at like the Maryland specific context, folks who have done work or pay attention to what's happening in Annapolis, Baltimore City represents what I think Black people represent to the American collective consciousness. That all of the pathologies are often projected onto Black folks, and notions of inherent criminality, notions of being inherently violent. And so a part of what happens when you think about like the urban areas, the so-called urban areas in Baltimore, like Baltimore City, contrast that to some of the more suburban areas that carry those notions, right? They carry those notions of inherent criminality. If you think about a lot of people who leave places like Baltimore City, like a lot of their attitudes is like, we don't want to be there with them people, right? That's a part of the attitude because of that mentality. And so what I want to add to what you raised is that there's a politics around notions of inherent pathology and criminality and violence of Black people that gets projected on to Baltimore City. And therefore the notions of addressing police brutality and things like disclosing these records politically become disadvantageous to folks who represent those areas where folks hold those attitudes. So one of the things I would add is that, similar to what Senator Carter mentioned, like really doing some organizing and those parts of Baltimore County, those parts of Harford County, parts of Howard County, parts of Anne Arundel County that have some of those conservative beliefs that I think get in the way of a lot of these reforms taking place. So just adding that in addition to the money, I think that's a dynamic that also makes it difficult to push some of these things through.
Can I add one little quick thing? 100% everything Davon said, but I think there's an additional component that isn't just about that. I think it's also about the way that this institution is structured, which is that it's a leadership-driven institution where leadership has all of the control. And so it is not in the interest of members to do anything to really challenge the leadership, because if so, then they lose. They lose in terms of their role here and their ability to be elevated into leadership positions, and frankly, sometimes even ability to pass legislation. And just how they're treated here, that's important. You can't expect people to get elected and then come here, and then here's the dilemma. Okay, either I do everything I'm told to do by the leadership and I'm elevated, I can pass bills, I can really bring home the bacon for my constituents, or I come here and I rock the boat and I challenge the leadership and I get absolutely nothing. I get 0 bills passed, I bring home no money for the resources for my district. It's a real dilemma.
I agree. I just want to offer one more thing to something you said in terms about police officers, sort of the way and sort of they see Black people. And it just sort of it reminds me. I've often found it interesting in cities, including definitely in Baltimore City's history as well, but I think about Ferguson as well, where you have predominantly Black cities, and yet my police force is predominantly white. And you're wondering why these people don't understand the communities in which you're dropping them in with no kind of cultural training, with nothing that helps them to recognize that maybe there are some cultural differences that they didn't grow with, but that they're not necessarily criminal. They don't necessarily make us bad people, but I'm like, it's interesting. And Ferguson comes to mind for me again, because again, with Mike Brown, I was like, how is it that this predominantly Black city has an all-white city council and police force? So I think some of that has to be a part of this, but I still go back to the onus to me is on our representatives. And yes, it's weird up in those halls in the Capitol. However, I think at some point our representatives need to put the people before their own aspirations. And if that means losing out on an election the next go round, so be it. But at some point we got to break this cycle to stop this same conversation.
We're going to do 2 more questions here in the back, and then I'm going to pop up to the front. Okay. This is. No, we're going to move up. Okay, this is, and I guess this question is a response to what Senator Carter said about the high emphasis on high crime. Can you elaborate more on the falseness of that narrative, and how we can better tackle crime, public safety without increasing police brutality? Besides transparency. because I know that was
For
mentioned
some reason, I
earlier.
couldn't see where that was coming. Oh, there you are. Okay. So I can give you a recent example, and I got to talk from a personal experience because it's heavy on my mind. So last year, the General Assembly passed something called the Juvenile Reform Bill. And what that bill did is it said that there's a floor for how young a person can be before they're charged with a crime and prosecuted. And so when we passed the legislation, what we said is that under the age of 10, a child can be prosecuted with no crime. And that under the age of 13, they can be prosecuted for only violent crimes, or what would be a felony if it were committed by an adult. Well, prior to the school to prison pipeline and the growth of criminalization of children, there was always these institutions that existed, the Department of Juvenile Services and Department of Social Services and Department of Health and Mental Hygiene handled children in need of assistance issues. They handled children in need of supervision issues and the like. So law enforcement has always had the ability to file petitions for children in need of assistance, children in need of supervision, child protective services, and a myriad of other things. The issue is that they haven't wanted to do it. So law enforcement has lied to the whole state and all the media outlets and said, oh, because of the law they passed, we can't prosecute these children that are bringing guns to school and committing all these awful crimes. Well, no, first of all, they're not responsible for what's prosecuted anyway. But what they can do is file a petition just like they file charges, right? Just like you file charges, you can file this petition. Department of Juvenile Services will investigate and decide what is the right path to address the needs and provide services for this child and this child's family. So that's a false narrative. If you look at the numbers, and I don't know them off the top of my head, but I've recently seen them, you're not going to believe this. Juvenile crime is down. And not just because they're not being prosecuted. Since 2017, there's been a severe decrease in acts committed by juveniles that are considered crimes. And so it's just a false narrative, but what I find is there's very little to no counter to that in the media. And even like in my situation, I've been saying it, and it's always mischaracterized like a cop-out or whatever, but I keep saying, the whole General Assembly passed this, right? A supermajority of the General Assembly passed this into law. It's not one legislator, but they single you out and make it seem like you're just like a one-person crusade, as opposed to this was the policy set forth by the state of Maryland. You just don't see a counter to that narrative. In fact, really quickly, about 6 or 7 or 8 different news outlets came to me, and they started off with, what do you say to the fact that Anne Arundel County Police say they can't prosecute all these kids and they have this huge uptick in all these crimes? And what I have said, but it just comes off like you're defending, because the premise is false, right? When your premise is wrong, then everything after that is wrong. So basically is that they're not telling the truth. So that's the answer. I mean, we just need better media coverage of the true stories and better counters to the false narratives.
So I was trying to hurry up and ask my question before any elected officials got here. But, because I'm going to get in trouble. But I'm just saying that up front. So a part of it is, to me, first of all, I thank you all, and I thank you all for your bravery, for those that are on the panel, and like from my heart, because we all know that it puts you in a specific place when you speak truth to power, because they're like, we can't have this conversation around these people because they know something we don't know and they're going to tell us. So my name is Will. In hearing this conversation about transparency, but also when you all are talking about our legislators, so for me, this is the troubled part. For me, I believe that what the recent reform legislation has shown us is that quite possibly you cannot separate the fact that what they characterize as a law enforcement agency is separate from the entire legislative governmental process, that they have all been built and established essentially as one operating system. And so as an organism, just like our bodies, we all have different organs that operate our body, which form an organism. I believe What it illustrates, particularly in the state of Maryland, is that they are inextricable, that we actually have to go in and maybe fine-tune other aspects of all of it, number one. Number two, what illustrates that to me is, I notice, because I happen to work in government, when there's conversations about what a law enforcement agency has done, or there's an issue related to police brutality or any other malfeasance, it is always othered. It becomes, look what they did. And I believe that what we need to do is force our elected officials, our law officers, to have to own that. And so to not always say they, and not always say, oh, the police department, because in actuality, it is each local operating agency is essentially that local government, right? And then the last thing kind of is when I had to do work locally in Anne Arundel County for police accountability, what you immediately saw in talking about transparency and trust, what you saw is local jurisdictions were interpreting what they wanted out of it. And no one, a couple of us, I know a lot of people up here raised their hand and said, hey, what's going on here? Because what happens is, and this proves my point about they're very closely related, is they didn't defer to those who had worked on these issues or the public. They deferred to their law offices and they deferred to law enforcement. And so, and the F.O.P. And so, all of our conversations here, all of it, to me, I think we need to challenge, this is the last thing I'll say on this. I think the radical part is when something happens in a police department, we should sue the boss. And who's the boss? And I bet you it'll change then. I bet you if the council persons, mayors, county council persons, county executives, I bet you that if instead of suing us as the public who pays those taxes, you're actually suing, like if you work for a private organization. If someone sues Microsoft, who gets sued? The shareholders and who else? Bill Gates. So that's my last part. And then okay, so, but don't attribute that to me when y'all talk about. All right, and the last thing is Amy, who was sitting right here from the ACLU, has two suggestions. One, time limits on how long they can deny a record because it's an open investigation, so time limits. Number two, that these laws need legal remedies so they can be sued and have to pay attorney's fees. So thank you all. Sorry to run my mouth.
I just want to say thank you, sir. Bingo, you hit the nail on the head. We are paying for this. We, the taxpayers, are paying for police brutality and the lack of justice in our individual jurisdictions. And there is a remedy, and I have established it in court. I sued Baltimore County in 2014 in what is called a mandamus. Now, the attorneys in here will know what that is. Basically, it is that taxpayers, our government is responsible to use our money responsibly for any services they provide. And when they're providing these services, they're getting sued for police brutality, for civil rights violations. In Baltimore County, in the last few years, it's gone over $12 million. I think with last summer's settlement in a suit, it was over 14 million. I wonder how many other jurisdictions are being sued. So when I sued Baltimore County, and it was over actually the operation of the animal shelter, we were denied standing in the local county court. And I had pro bono attorneys from Covington and Burley in Washington, D.C., who were crackerjack attorneys. And they said, what? We went in, first hearing we had, they said, you don't have standing. They pursued it. It took 5 years. And I think it was in 2020, I guess it was, 2020, the Court of Maryland, the Appeals Court of Maryland overturned that. And all of a sudden, there appeared a newspaper article that said, wait a minute, this means that people then can sue for other services in other jurisdictions. So, then we have to look at the policies that are leading to this wasteful spending of money. Just thought I'd share that.
Miss George, I'm so proud of you. So, Will, you said you wanted to get it out before the elected officials came in the room. Hello? No. Can I just give a quick shout out, though? Did you all, to our controller, is that Brooke Learman back there? Thanks for coming.
We might have time for maybe 1 or 2 questions.
Good afternoon. Delegate Gabriel Severo, represent District 39 in Montgomery County. Appreciate all the sentiments shared. Just wanted to share a couple of pieces of legislation that are currently being considered this session for folks who haven't been following the Police Accountability Work Group. As a member of that work group, I brought up a number of issues that I believe are also related to police accountability that the legislation from 2021 did not address. One being ending no-knock warrants in the state of Maryland. We did not actually end it. We reformed it to what I like to call business hours. I know there was a lot of folks who talked about suits and holding law enforcement liable. What we need to do is end qualified immunity in state court so that there is that kind of accountability in the court system and the taxpayers aren't being left holding the bag. The highest police brutality suit case that's been paid out to date was right here in Maryland in Prince George's County with $20 million. So if your jurisdiction is not in legit, the local government insurance trust, it is more than likely that that is coming out of the operating budget of your local jurisdiction. So we need to end qualified immunity in state court. We need to address white nationalism in law enforcement. It is a serious problem. We have not even looked at this at all. We're not even discussing it. But if we talk about racialized policing, we got to do something about white nationalism in law enforcement. We got to hold these prosecutors accountable. These are the people we elect. You talk about the F.O.P. The F.O.P. endorses and supports all of your state's attorneys. How many of you all are challenging those state's attorneys and attorney generals for accepting contributions and endorsement from the Fraternal Order of Police, an organization that I have not accepted endorsement or money from, but recognized as an expressly anti-black organization? That's the work that you all got to do for your elected officials. And then lastly, it's cops in schools. We cannot keep ignoring the fact that we are arresting babies, putting them in school to prison pipeline and disrupting their education. So it's still work that we need to do. Do not assume because we passed the Police Accountability Act. Wasn't perfect. I would have liked to see it go further, but there's a lot of stuff that we still need to do on pushing elected officials on. Thank you.
So I missed you back there. I'm sorry, but you all, when I introduced myself and talked about the Anton's Law, that's Gabriel Acevedo, and you can tell the House sponsor of Anton's Law. Sorry about that, unless you gave.
We've got a few folks up here.
All right, so we're just gonna do one more question. Yep.
It's been waiting for a little bit.
I can't see him from my seat, so it makes sense.
Thank you. I'm Thornell Jones, the president of World Class Grads, which is totally focused on the blueprint for Maryland being successful. Without this problem being addressed, it will not be successful because the school-to-prison pipeline is being driven by this police problem. My question is, for 50 years, I'm 85 years old, for 50 years I've been trying to figure out why is it that law enforcement is allowed to call my phone and ask me for money? That should be illegal. It's definitely unethical.
I'll just say something briefly to that, and I agree with you. I think that one of the things that's important to note about the F.O.P., they have a lot of money. They have a very robust operation, and to the extent that people in our communities are organizing for police accountability, I think it's equally important to organize against the F.O.P. Because of the tremendous amount of resources and power and credibility, unfortunately, that they have in local government and statewide government.
I think that concludes our panel. Thank you all so much. And I just want to quickly plug in that if you are interested in working on these issues, the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability is to continue to monitor and work on these issues. We meet every third Thursday of the month. And if you're interested, please see Olivia in the back. Olivia, if you can raise your hand, give her your email, we'll add you to the listserv. Thank you, everyone.